an emotional and dramatic tribute to the victims of 9/11, the hijackings, the collapse of the Twin Towers, the burning Pentagon, the counterattack of Flight 93, the global hunt for Al-Qaeda, and the decades-long aftermath that changed America forever. He had always been the kind of man who blended into the background quiet, unremarkable, profoundly invisible. When investigators later tried to reconstruct every hour of Stephen Paddock's life before the Las Vegas mass shooting, they found themselves staring into a void that felt more like an intentional erasure than an absence. Paddock had lived as if he were determined to leave nothing behind except financial records, gambling receipts, and a trail of benign motel check-ins that never suggested the storm that was brewing inside him. Yet on the night of the 1st of October 2017, he would turn the 32nd floor of the Mandalay Bay Resort and Casino into the stage of the deadliest mass shooting in modern American history, killing 58 people and injuring hundreds more in a span of minutes that felt eternal. Investigators would spend years trying to understand how a man with no criminal record, no known ideological motivation, and no prior violent behavior could unleash such devastation. The real story, the journey toward that night, the small decisions, the concealed preparations, the subtle signs that hid in plain sight is a slow, chilling descent into the greatest unanswered true crime mystery of the 21st century. In the weeks leading up to the massacre, Las Vegas was beginning its transition from the brutal desert heat of late summer into the cooler evenings of early fall. Tourists flooded the Strip, chasing the neon promises of music, money, and indulgence. The Route 91 Harvest Festival, a country music gathering held across from Mandalay Bay, drew thousands of fans from across the country. There was no sense of danger in the air, only celebration, laughter, cowboy boots scuffing the asphalt, plastic cups clinking, and the kind of carefree atmosphere that happens when thousands come together to forget the world for a while. None of them knew that a man in a corner suite above them was loading rifles, adjusting scopes, arranging ammunition in tactical patterns, and measuring distances with cold precision. But months earlier, in secret, Paddock's life had already begun to shift. He had been a high-stakes gambler for decades, the kind who understood probability better than most mathematicians. He played video poker not as entertainment, but as an analytical, obsessive ritual. Casinos knew his name not because he caused trouble, but because he spent money, lost money, and came back again and again with the calm detachment of someone running an algorithm in his head. His financial records showed no desperation. He was comfortable, wealthy enough, a man who owned property, who traveled, who sent his girlfriend on trips to visit family overseas. But something inside him was tightening, fracturing, shifting. No one close to him could pinpoint the moment it began. He purchased his weapons legally, every rifle, every round of ammunition, every scope, every bump stock, everything was bought within the bounds of the law. Quietly, without raising an eyebrow, his background checks came back clean. He made the purchases at different times, at different stores, without revealing the grander pattern behind the accumulation. It was only when investigators later assembled the receipts that the scale became clear. Dozens of firearms, thousands of rounds, specialized equipment to convert semi-automatic rifles into weapons capable of firing at terrifying speeds. Yet even then, the purchases were spaced far enough apart, hidden within the normalcy of American gun culture, that no single event triggered alarm. He had practiced. This, above all, unsettled the investigators. Evidence suggested he had tested firing angles and distances at shooting ranges in Nevada. He researched the vulnerabilities of crowds and studied the layouts of various music festivals. In the weeks before the Las Vegas massacre, Paddock rented hotel rooms overlooking large gatherings in Chicago and Boston, rooms that gave him elevated vantage points similar to the one he would eventually use. These were dry runs, quiet rehearsals, for a catastrophe he had fully envisioned but had not yet chosen to unleash. When investigators traced these reservations, they confronted the disturbing possibility that Las Vegas wasn't an impulse, it was the chosen finale after several options had been considered. His girlfriend, meanwhile, had been sent to the Philippines with a large sum of money. She later claimed she thought it was his way of helping her family, a gesture of generosity. Investigators wondered whether it was something else entirely, a way of ensuring she was far away when he carried out his plan, or perhaps a final attempt to sever personal ties before destroying everything else. She insisted she had seen no signs, no anger, no radicalization, no ideology, and she wasn't wrong. There were no political manifestos, no extremist affiliations, no rambling diaries filled with rage. That absence, more than anything, became the central mystery of the case. In late September 2017, Paddock checked into the Mandalay Bay Hotel under his own name. He requested a suite overlooking the Las Vegas Village concert grounds where the Route 91 Harvest Festival would soon be held. The concierge saw nothing unusual. High rollers requested specific rooms all the time, especially those with good views of the Strip. His demeanor was calm, polite, patient. He had been staying in hotels his entire adult life. He knew how to blend in. The staff remembered him as quiet, tidy, unremarkable. No one who interacted with him sensed that they were speaking with a man who had already chosen the date and location of his attack. Over the next few days, he brought luggage dozens of bags up to his suite. Bellhops helped him. No one questioned why a man staying alone needed so many bags. Las Vegas is a place where excess doesn't stand out. Some guests bring costumes, props, equipment. Others bring more clothes than they could possibly wear. Some are entertainers, some are gamblers, some are eccentric wealthy retirees. Nothing about Paddock's behavior broke the pattern. He tipped adequately, spoke little, kept to himself. His movements were calm. Even the security footage later reviewed by police revealed no agitation, no unusual pacing, no visible signs of emotional disturbance. He moved with the detached smoothness of someone who had rehearsed every step. Inside his room, he began positioning rifles near the windows. He used power tools to detach one of the windows, turning it into a lethal perch. He installed cameras in the hallway outside his suite, giving him full view of anyone approaching. He brought food to minimize the need for room service. He studied the crowd below. At night, he watched as festival attendees gathered, danced, and sang. The distance was approximately 400 yards, well within the effective range of the rifles he had brought. The angle was ideal. The crowd density was extraordinary. He was preparing not for a moment of rage, but for a meticulously calculated attack. Investigators later reconstructed his timeline. On September 30, the day before the shooting, Paddock spent hours in his suite arranging weapons. He carried cases of ammunition to the floor-to-ceiling windows. He positioned one rifle after another on bipods, adjusting their stability on the carpet. He arranged them so that when one overheated or jammed, he could drop it instantly and switch to another. He calibrated his scopes to compensate for the shooting angle. He used a rangefinder to verify distances. Everything pointed to a methodical operational mindset. And yet, the mystery remained. Why? There were no signs of financial ruin, no recent trauma, no terminal illness, no extremist ideology. People who knew him described him as an introverted loner, but not a violent one. He had no history of domestic abuse, no criminal record, no threats made online or in person. The attack stood alone, disconnected from any understandable motive, which made it all the more terrifying. The morning of the 1st of October 2017 was unremarkable for most of Las Vegas. Tourists wandered the Strip, casino floors buzzed, and festival goers lined up early to secure good spots near the stage for the Route 91 Harvest Festival's final night. Jason Aldean, the headlining country star, was scheduled to take the stage around 9:30 p.m. Families, couples, groups of friends, many on vacation filled the venue. They bought drinks, took photos, and danced as the desert heat slowly faded into a warm, breezy evening. The atmosphere was joyful, oblivious. No one looked up toward the heavily tinted windows of the Mandalay Bay, which glowed softly against the skyline. As the sun set behind the mountains, Paddock made his final preparations. He moved silently across his suite, checking weapons, reloading magazines, arranging firing lines. His demeanor was calm, almost mechanical. It was as if he had already mentally detached himself from the body performing these actions. At 9:36 p.m., he locked the door for the final time. He had barricaded parts of the hallway to delay police response. His surveillance cameras were streaming live to his laptop. He was ready. 9 minutes later, At 9:45 p.m., Jason Aldean began performing When She Says Baby. Thousands of fans raised their phones, capturing the opening chords. The music pulsed across the crowd like a heartbeat. Paddock stood behind the rifle closest to the window, adjusted the scope, and stared through the crosshairs at the largest concentration of people. At 10:05 p.m., the first shots rang out. They were sharp, mechanical, and echoing like fireworks. But wrong, too fast, too aggressive, too relentless. Many in the crowd initially believed it was part of the show. Others thought it was a malfunction in the audio system. Only when people began falling, when screams replaced laughter, did the truth ripple through the venue with suffocating clarity. Chaos erupted. Thousands dropped to the ground, seeking cover where none existed. Others ran, stumbled, collided with strangers. The sound of gunfire grew louder, faster, more violent. It felt omnipresent, as if the bullets came from every direction. Witnesses later described the horror of not knowing where the shooter was. Some believed there were multiple attackers. Some believed the shots were coming from the ground. But Paddock had the high ground, the perfect vantage point, and an arsenal designed to maximize carnage. He fired in waves. Long bursts, then pauses. Rapid volleys that swept across the crowd like a scythe. The bump stock accelerated the rifle's fire rate to near-automatic levels. One of his rifles overheated and jammed. He dropped it instantly and grabbed another. He moved between two windows to alter his angle of attack, creating confusion among those below. At 10:12 p.m., officers on the ground identified the Mandalay Bay as the source of the gunfire. Snipers positioned themselves below, scanning the windows for muzzle flashes. The festival grounds were a war zone. People were bleeding, crying, praying, calling loved ones, dragging friends to safety, using metal barricades as makeshift shields. The sound of bullets striking the ground, the thud of bodies, the screams, it all melded into a grotesque symphony of terror. Inside the hotel, security began coordinating with police. The 32nd floor was identified as the origin. Officers moved cautiously, hearing the echo of shots bouncing through the stairwells. Paddock watched them through his cameras. When he saw police converging, his firing became more erratic, as if he knew the clock was running out. Yet he did not attempt to escape. He did not try to negotiate or hold hostages. He did not leave a manifesto. His actions were singular in purpose: kill as many people as possible, as efficiently as possible. At 10:15 p.m., the gunfire stopped. Investigators believe this was the moment Paddock ended his own life. But the officers outside his door did not know that. They were trained to expect booby traps, explosives, and hostages. They waited, assessed, listened. The silence was suffocating. The hallway cameras Paddock had placed were still recording, capturing the shifting shadows of officers moving into position. At 11:20 p.m., more than an hour after the first shots, police breached the door to his suite. The explosion of the breach charge lit the room with a flash. Officers swept inside, guns raised, expecting an ambush. Instead, they found silence. Dozens of rifles lay scattered across the floor. Spent shell casings coated the carpet like metallic confetti. Broken glass littered the area near the windows. And in the corner of the room, slumped on the floor, was Stephen Paddock, dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. But the real horror of that night was not inside the room. It was outside, below, where 58 lives had been taken, where hundreds lay injured, where thousands more carried the psychological scars of surviving one of the most traumatic events in modern American history. Immediately, Las Vegas descended into an emergency, the likes of which it had never seen. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Ambulances ran nonstop. Strangers carried the wounded in their arms, in pickup trucks, in police cars. Blood donation centers were flooded with volunteers. Doctors worked for hours without rest. Nurses cried between patients. The city's first responders became heroes in real time. But as the city scrambled to save lives, investigators were confronted with the chilling aftermath inside Paddock's room. They photographed every weapon, every spent casing, every window angle. They examined his cameras, his laptop, his notes. They found calculations scribbled on a yellow notepad. Angles, distances, bullet trajectories, confirming that this massacre had been engineered with mathematical precision. But they did not find the one thing they desperately needed: a motive. He left no message, no explanation, no declaration, no manifesto, nothing but silence. And so the investigation began. The moment officers stepped into the suite, they were struck first not by chaos but by order. The rifles were arranged in purposeful positions around the room, their bipods anchored into the carpet, their optics calibrated for the precise long-distance shots he had fired. Ammunition boxes, neatly stacked, lined the walls. Power tools lay near the windows where he had removed the glass panels, reinforcing the idea that this room had not been simply occupied, it had been engineered. The smell of gunpowder was still thick in the air, layered with the metallic scent of spent casings. The silence felt unnatural, as if the violence of the previous minutes still hung in the molecules of the room, lingering, unwilling to dissipate. The officers approached Paddock's body cautiously. His blood had begun to pool, but his face showed no signs of rage or fear or satisfaction. He looked disturbingly calm, as if even in death he refused to reveal anything. Near him lay the handgun he had used to kill himself, a final act performed with the same detached precision as everything else. It was the one moment in the entire event where the investigators felt any hint of emotional act, but even that was questionable. Some wondered if he had always intended to die. Others believed he had hoped to continue firing longer, but the breach of the door forced his hand. No theory satisfied everyone. The unknowns far outweighed the facts. FBI agents arrived quickly, and the room transformed into a forensic hive. Every inch of the suite was photographed, documented, dusted, and measured. They cataloged every weapon. 23 rifles, most of them modified for rapid fire, thousands of rounds of ammunition, scopes, bipods, loaded magazines, and a stockpile of tools. The image of this arsenal spread across the carpet was soon shown to the world, but the emotional weight of standing inside that room, inside the mind of a man who had chosen this path, was something the public could never fully absorb. Investigators later admitted that even hardened agents felt unnerved. One detail stood out among the machinery of violence: the handwritten calculations on the yellow legal pad. They were cold, clinical, nearly obsessive. Bullet drop estimations, distance measurements, a precise table predicting the crowd's density at different times in the festival. He had studied wind conditions in Las Vegas. He had calculated the time between sets in the concert. He had even accounted for the Doppler effect on sound to anticipate how long it would take for people below to realize the direction of the shots. It was not the handwriting of a disordered mind. It was the handwriting of someone treating murder like a mathematical problem to be solved. The sight chilled every agent who viewed it. As the forensic teams processed the suite, another effort unfolded across Las Vegas. Hospitals were overflowing. The Sunrise Hospital Trauma Center worked through the night, performing one emergency surgery after another. Doctors described wounds they had only seen in war zones. Nurses sprinted across hallways, carrying blood bags. Volunteers lined up outside, so many that officers had to ask some to return the next day. The human toll, physical, emotional, psychological, was only beginning to reveal itself. Survivors described lying on the ground, unable to move, watching strangers die inches away. Some played dead. Some shielded loved ones with their own bodies. Some prayed. Some ran through clouds of dust kicked up by bullets hitting the pavement. Trauma counselors would later call the mass panic one of the most severe they had ever documented. While the hospitals fought to save the wounded, law enforcement agencies across Nevada and the United States mobilized. The shooter's identity was confirmed less than 2 hours after officers entered the room. Stephen Craig Paddock, 64 years old, retired accountant, professional gambler, no criminal record, no prior arrests, no history of violence, no affiliations with extremist groups, no manifesto, no evident political grievances, no social media presence, no clear enemies. He was, on paper, the least likely suspect imaginable. This lack of a motive became the engine that drove the investigation through the night. Agents stormed Paddock's home in Mesquite, Nevada, expecting to find something, anything, that could make sense of what he had done. But the house was as meticulously organized as the suite. Dozens more firearms were discovered, all legal. boxes of ammunition, ledger sheets tracking his gambling habits, computers, but none containing extremist content or communications, files, but none explaining his intentions. In the garage sat tools, luggage, and neatly arranged equipment. The refrigerator was stocked. The dishwasher was half full. The home felt frozen in time, as if he had simply stepped out and never returned. Agents hoped the computers would contain a digital trail, emails, searches, manifestos, but the data yielded almost nothing. No radicalization, no hatred, no delusions, no threats. He had been a ghost living in the digital era, leaving virtually no online footprint. His search history was mundane: gambling strategies, financial documents, real estate listings, nothing that foreshadowed the scale of violence he would unleash. One small detail, however, caught the attention of analysts. He had repeatedly searched for information about outdoor concerts, crowd sizes, and high-rise vantage points. While not explicitly incriminating on their own, these searches, combined with his hotel reservations overlooking other large gatherings, painted a chilling picture. This was not spontaneous. This was not an emotional outburst. This was a premeditated, calculated massacre for reasons that remained entirely hidden. At the same time, agents interviewed his girlfriend, who had flown back from the Philippines in shock after learning what he had done. Her grief was genuine, her confusion overwhelming. She could not reconcile the man she knew, the polite, distant, financially supportive partner, with the monster the world now saw. She insisted he had never expressed anger, resentment, or ideology. She had never seen him commit an act of violence or even raise his voice. She described him as quiet, analytical, introverted, often lost in thought but never dark or hostile. He was a man who didn't talk about feelings, she said repeatedly. He kept everything inside. But what had been inside him? What had grown, metastasized, hardened? Investigators turned their attention to his finances. They found that while he was wealthy, he had recently experienced some losses in gambling. But these losses were not catastrophic. His accounts were stable. He was still ahead financially. He had purchased weapons, yes, but he had also purchased plane tickets, groceries, and mundane items like tools and clothing. He continued paying his bills. He sent his girlfriend money for her family. He ate meals in restaurants. Nothing in his spending suggested desperation. Then there were the medications. He had been prescribed Valium months before the shooting. Benzodiazepines can cause irritability or aggression in some individuals, but there was no evidence he abused them. His medical records were ordinary. He had no terminal illness, no chronic pain, no psychological diagnosis. His doctor later said he never seemed distressed or angry. Still, when you sift through the details long enough, a subtle pattern begins to appear. A man slowly isolating himself from the world. His gambling trips became longer and more solitary. His conversations with neighbors grew increasingly sparse. He withdrew from social circles. He had few friends, and those who remained described him as distant. Not troubled, not volatile, but detached, emotionally muted, as if he were gradually fading from ordinary life. But none of this explained the enormity of what he did. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit began constructing a psychological profile. They examined every known detail of his childhood, his family history, his relationships, his career, his behavior patterns. His father had been a bank robber who once appeared on the FBI's most wanted list. Some theorized that growing up with a criminal father could have influenced his worldview, but he had been raised mostly by his mother and had no record of violence. He was intelligent but not socially adept. He preferred numbers to people. He was methodical, perhaps even obsessive, but nothing pointed toward mass murder. His brother and relatives expressed disbelief. They described him as calm, sometimes odd, but never dangerous. His girlfriend described him as generous and gentle. Nothing in the testimonies hinted at deep-seated hatred. Nothing explained why a man who lived quietly for 64 years would abruptly choose to commit one of the most horrifying acts in American history. The absence of motive became the black hole at the center of the investigation. Meanwhile, as investigators combed through evidence, stories from survivors filled the city. A mother searching for her missing daughter, a husband who held his dying wife in his arms as bullets rained down. Friends separated in the chaos, reunited hours later in hospital hallways or police stations. Strangers who shielded one another. Bystanders who tore pieces of clothing to bandage wounds. The human suffering left a crater in the community so deep that even seasoned officers found themselves emotionally shaken. Las Vegas, a city built on spectacle, found itself facing a tragedy it could not escape or disguise. Folks on the Strip paused, spoke in hushed tones, laid flowers along the concert grounds fence. Casino lights still flashed, but something beneath the neon had dimmed. The city that prided itself on being unshakable found itself trembling, its heart cracked by the incomprehensible. Investigators expanded the search to Paddock's second home in Reno, another meticulously organized space filled with legal weapons, tools, and supplies. His vehicle yielded more ammunition and traces of explosives. He had components that could be used to make bombs, though nothing indicated he planned to use them that night. Even here, his preparations pointed to obsession, not impulse. They traced his recent travels, his stays in Chicago and Boston, his rental car trips around the Southwest. Everywhere he went, he left no emotional footprint, just the logistical residue of a man conducting reconnaissance. No witnesses recalled him behaving strangely. No hotel staff remembered confrontations. He spoke little. He caused no scenes. He left rooms tidy. He paid bills promptly. He appeared as a man living life simply, but the pattern revealed a man building towards something catastrophic. Then came the most disquieting discovery of all. His laptop's hard drive was missing, removed intentionally, presumably destroyed. Investigators scoured the room, the hallway, the dumpsters, nearby areas. They never found it. The missing hard drive represented the last piece of a puzzle that Paddock did not want solved. It suggested that he knew investigators would search, and he chose to erase something rather than leave it behind. But what had been on the drive? Notes? Confessions? Calculations? Searches? Communications? The possibilities were endless, the truth forever sealed. This single detail intensified the mystery. If Paddock wanted no motive known, then the act of destruction suggested intentional secrecy. But why hide the motive if the motive was political, ideological, or personal? Why not proclaim something? Why leave nothing? It contradicted the behavior of most mass shooters. They crave recognition, power, legacy. But Paddock left the world confused, not enlightened. Agents interviewed hundreds of people in the following weeks: casino employees, gun store owners, neighbors, relatives, doctors, dealers at the poker machines he frequented. The story remained consistent. No one saw it coming. No one sensed a monster. There were no clues, no outbursts, no threats. He had been a man who lived in quiet calculation, keeping everything inside, never revealing the storm building beneath his calm veneer. But small cracks appeared in his past. He had once told a friend he felt like he was losing symptoms of physical sensation, suggesting possible neurological issues. He expressed mild paranoia about government surveillance. Not unusual for gamblers who handle large sums of money, but enough to raise eyebrows in hindsight. He occasionally described himself as depressed or anxious but never sought treatment. He gambled obsessively, sometimes for days without rest. These hints were faint, isolated, and ultimately inconclusive. As the investigation dug deeper, forensic psychologists began to suspect that Paddock might have been experiencing a progressive mental disorder, perhaps an undiagnosed condition, perhaps neurological degeneration. His autopsy revealed microscopic changes in his brain, but nothing definitive. No tumor, no lesion, no structural anomaly that could explain mass violence. The absence of a clear neurological explanation forced investigators back to square one. Meanwhile, prosecutors prepared reports. Officers compiled timelines. Survivors attempted to reconstruct the moments that had shattered their lives. Families of victims searched for closure. Journalists pressed for answers the FBI did not have. Politicians debated policies. And through it all, the specter of the unanswered why hovered like a shadow over every discussion. The FBI eventually assigned hundreds of agents to the case. They combed through tens of thousands of hours of footage, reviewed more than 22,000 leads, and conducted over 500 interviews. They followed financial trails, medical histories, digital data, and social connections. They built psychological profiles and cross-referenced behavioral models. They examined every weapon for signs of modification. They recreated the shooting from ballistic models. They tested the rifles Paddock used, analyzing heat thresholds and jamming rates. They even measured the carpet fibers beneath the bipods to determine firing positions. Every detail told the same story: enormous preparation, extreme calculation, total silence. And the silence became unbearable. Investigators returned repeatedly to his girlfriend's testimony, searching for contradictions, inconsistencies, subtle hints, but she was consistent. He was quiet, distant, emotionally reserved, and absorbed in numbers. He sometimes seemed detached, as if living partly outside the world. He played video poker endlessly, drawn into the patterns, the repetition, the statistics. No signs of violence, no outbursts, no ideological statements. She believed he loved her in his own quiet way, though he expressed it mostly through financial support rather than emotional engagement. Agents also revisited his travels, particularly his stay in Chicago, where he had rented a room overlooking the Lollapalooza festival. The thought chilled them. Tens of thousands of people had stood below the windows of that hotel, unaware of how close they came to tragedy. Paddock had ultimately chosen Las Vegas, perhaps because he knew the terrain better, perhaps because of the vantage point, perhaps because of the crowd size, or perhaps for reasons that died with him. One persistent theory emerged: that Paddock was motivated not by ideology or hatred, but by a desire to engineer a perfect act of destruction. A tragic, horrifying theory, but one supported by the mathematical precision of his preparations. Some investigators believed he was driven by a compulsion to conduct an experiment of violence at a scale never seen before. Others argued this was impossible without ideological or emotional fuel. The debate never reached consensus. Weeks turned into months. The FBI continued interviews. Survivors continued to heal. Some regained their ability to walk. Others suffered permanent disabilities. Many were plagued by nightmares. PTSD cases soared. The trauma reverberated across the city. The memorial near the concert grounds grew with photos, flowers, letters, and candles. Each face a life interrupted. Each letter a plea for understanding. But the answers would not come easily. When the FBI released its final report, it offered no definitive motive. It concluded that Paddock was an intensely private individual who wanted to gain a sense of control and significance through mass violence. It suggested he may have been experiencing a decline in physical and mental health, but it admitted something rare. They could not provide a clear explanation. They could not answer the why. The Las Vegas shooting remained, and remains, one of the most enigmatic mass killings in modern history. Even years later, investigators are haunted by the emptiness of the motive. How do you categorize a crime committed with such precision yet devoid of any stated purpose? How do you reconcile a life of quiet calculation with an act of catastrophic violence? How do you interpret a man who spent decades blending into the background and then shattered thousands of lives in minutes? The answers, if they existed, died in that suite. In the end, the Las Vegas massacre became not only a tragedy, but a mystery, a dark void of intention that experts still struggle to comprehend. And for the families, the survivors, the first responders, and the investigators, the absence of motive added a cruel layer to their suffering. They were left not only grieving but questioning, searching for meaning in senseless destruction. Yet the story of the Las Vegas shooting does not end in that room, or even in the investigation that followed. The threads of trauma, resilience, and unresolved questions continue to ripple through the years that followed, shaping lives, policies, and the collective psyche of a nation. And the final chapter of this tragedy, the longest, most complex, and most emotionally devastating, would come not in the night of the shooting, nor in the days after, but in the slow, painful, and deeply human process of healing, rebuilding, and understanding. In the weeks that followed, Las Vegas existed in two parallel realities. On the surface, the lights of the Strip still shimmered. Performers took the stage, Slot machines sang their hypnotic melodies, and tourists flocked in as if nothing had happened. But beneath that veneer, beneath the neon and music and alcohol, lay a wound too deep to be ignored. People who passed the Mandalay Bay felt their stomachs twist, knowing that just above those windows, a man had orchestrated devastation with deliberate precision. Residents who drove past the festival grounds lowered their voices instinctively, as if raising them might disturb the echoes of screams still lingering in the desert air. Survivors walked with invisible shadows behind them. Some refused to return to the city. Others remained trapped in cycles of memory, replaying the sounds of gunfire in their minds, flinching at loud noises, haunted by nightmares that left them breathless in bed. The trauma was not a single moment, it was a living pulse that continued to beat. The investigators, too, were caught in that emotional vortex. Some could not forget the sight of the suite, the rows of rifles, the scattered casings, the deliberate organization. Others remained unsettled by the fact that Paddock had shown no panic in his final moments. His suicide was not frantic, not chaotic. It was as methodical as the rest of his actions. That coldness haunted them. Officers assigned to reconstruct the shooting listened to audio over and over, isolating gunfire patterns, studying timing, examining how his methods evolved during the attack. With each analysis, the reality grew more disturbing. Paddock had improved his aim. He had adjusted angles. He had paused, not out of hesitation, but to switch weapons efficiently. The massacre had been a sequence of deliberate choices, executed with the precision of a man solving a grim equation. Those who responded to the scene at the concert grounds bore scars that would never fully heal. Veterans who had served in war zones described the chaos as more disorienting than combat. Firefighters and paramedics spoke of reaching victims whose injuries were impossible to treat. One paramedic recalled cradling a woman who asked him if she was going to die. Without an answer, he simply held her hand until her grip loosened. Another officer described searching for survivors among bodies that were indistinguishable from one another in the dark. The stories collected by investigators during the months after the shooting created a portrait of humanity at its most vulnerable. Terror, courage, despair, survival intertwined in a tapestry of raw, unfiltered emotion. Families of the victims navigated their grief in different ways. Some held vigils. Some demanded policy change. Some fell into silence, unable to articulate the weight pressing on their chests. Children learned that their parents were never coming home. Partners learned what it meant to grieve someone who left for a night of music and never returned. Parents learned how to bury their sons and daughters. Friends created memorials in bedrooms, leaving photos untouched, preserving memories in frames as if freezing time could heal the wound. The city erected temporary memorials, which grew so large that people traveled from other states to leave letters, crosses, and tokens of remembrance. Every candle lit at night seemed to represent a life extinguished too soon. Inside the FBI headquarters, the investigation entered its most exhaustive and psychologically draining phase. Agents went through every transaction Paddock had made over the last decade. They constructed timelines that spanned years, attempting to identify behavioral deviations. Some agents spent so much time inside conference rooms filled with documents that they admitted losing track of the days. They interviewed former co-workers, casino employees, neighbors from states he had previously lived in. Some described him as polite but distant. Others said he was awkward but harmless. A former landlord recalled that he paid rent early every month. A casino hostess remembered him tipping adequately but never smiling. One neighbor mentioned he seemed like someone who wasn't fully there, though she couldn't explain what she meant. The descriptions painted the picture of a man who existed more as an outline than a person present, functioning, but emotionally hollow. The lack of motive became the centerpiece of national discussion. News commentators speculated nightly. Some insisted he must have been secretly radicalized. Others believed he was mentally ill. Some proposed conspiracies involving accomplices, but each theory collapsed under scrutiny. There was no evidence of extremist ideology in his searches, writings, or communications. No manifesto. No coded messages. No history of delusion or psychosis. Medical examinations revealed no brain tumor, no dementia, no structural abnormalities that could explain violence. Toxicology reports showed no drug influence. Interviews revealed partial paranoia about government agencies, but nothing extreme. He had no financial ruin. He had no terminal illness. He had no personal grievance against anyone at the festival. Theories rose and fell like passing storms, but none illuminated the truth. As the months passed, investigators began to confront an unsettling possibility that the motive might never be found. Not because it was hidden, but because it did not fit into any framework society understood. Perhaps his intention lived entirely within his private mind, unspoken, unrecorded, unrevealed. A cognitive shadow that left no trace. In the absence of explanation, the human instinct is to search for patterns, to assemble fragments into meaning. But Paddock had left only fragments with no shape, like pieces of a puzzle from different boxes, unsolvable by design. Yet the investigation continued. Agents reviewed surveillance tapes from casinos he visited in the months before the attack. They watched him move from machine to machine, expressionless, calm, engaged in the repetitive rhythm of video poker. They analyzed his gambling transactions, noting he had lost more money recently than usual, though not catastrophically. Some behavioral analysts theorized that he may have been compensating emotionally for something: internal pain, dissatisfaction, decline, but the theory remained speculative. Emotional states leave no paper trails. They dug into his communication with his girlfriend. The messages were mundane grocery reminders, travel plans, brief conversations without emotional depth. Nothing in the tone suggested hatred or violence. But what stood out was the lack of affection. He communicated like a man handling business, not like someone sharing life with a partner. Some analysts believed this emotional emptiness reflected a capacity for detachment that could, in theory, facilitate violence. But many people lack emotional expression without becoming violent. The correlation felt incomplete. The FBI's behavioral specialists conducted a deep dive assessment into his personality. They concluded he likely possessed traits associated with introversion, emotional restraint, and obsessive tendencies. He exhibited a need for control, which appeared in his finances, his gambling strategies, his meticulous record-keeping, and his preparations for the attack. Some believed he might have suffered from undiagnosed anxiety or depression masked by routine. Others pointed to possible neurological decline, hinted at by his complaints about physical numbness. Still others theorized that he may have experienced a midlife existential crisis that escalated into catastrophic behavior. But none of these explanations were definitive. They were possibilities, not answers. Meanwhile, survivors struggled to rebuild their lives. Some returned to work, attempting to reintegrate into routines that no longer felt normal. Others couldn't enter crowded spaces without panic rising in their throats. Many found themselves unable to sleep without medication. Some began drinking excessively. Some entered therapy. Some isolated themselves, unwilling to speak about what they had endured. The marriages of several survivors fractured under the weight of trauma. Friendships dissolved. Depression took root in many who had never experienced mental illness before. Trauma counselors described the aftermath as one of the most widespread and severe they had ever witnessed. One survivor, a man who had shielded his wife with his body, later told investigators that he had no memory of running. He remembered gunfire, screaming, and then waking up in a hospital bed. He had been shot in the back but survived. His wife had not. He told investigators that he replayed the moment endlessly, wondering if he could have done more, moved faster, shielded her more fully. The guilt consumed him. Another survivor, a young woman whose best friend died next to her, said she could no longer listen to music without feeling sick. A mother who lost her son said she had removed every mirror from her home because she could not bear to see her own face, knowing she had outlived him. These stories filled the halls of hospitals, therapy centers, support groups, and investigators' notebooks. They served as raw evidence of the shooting's aftermath, a long-term trauma that extended far beyond the immediate casualties. For investigators, the emotional toll became another layer of responsibility. They were not merely solving a crime, they were seeking closure for thousands of people who had suffered, each in their own way. In Washington, policymakers debated legislation. Discussions centered around bump stocks, the devices that allowed Paddock to fire at near-automatic rates. Some politicians argued they should be banned. Others resisted. The technical details of the devices became part of the public lexicon. Many Americans had never heard the term before the shooting. Now, it was everywhere. News broadcasts, congressional hearings, social media arguments. Eventually, federal regulations were implemented, but debates continued for years. The missing laptop hard drive remained the single most perplexing physical clue. Investigators believed it had been intentionally removed to conceal something, perhaps files, notes, searches, anything that could provide insight. But without it, they were left with conjecture. Some believed that the drive contained evidence of personal turmoil he did not want revealed. Others believed it held details about his planning. A few theorized it contained something so private related to shame or decline that he wanted no one to ever know. But the truth remained sealed. Law enforcement reconstructed the room dozens of times. They tested different firing angles. They positioned mannequins to study line-of-sight trajectories. They measured bullet paths with lasers and reenacted the timing of magazine changes. They studied how he had used both windows to maximize coverage. They examined the bipod indentations in the carpet to confirm firing positions. They even simulated the gunfire acoustics to understand how sound had echoed across the festival grounds. Each detail confirmed the same reality: this attack was not the result of impulse, rage, or emotion. It was the result of a planned, calculated, measured operation executed by a man who left no clear trace of his motivation. Months turned into a year. The public pressure for answers intensified. Families demanded explanations in meetings with FBI officials. Some expressed frustration. Some expressed anger. Many expressed heartbreak. They wanted closure. They wanted to understand why their loved ones had been taken so violently, why they had been forced into a nightmare, why the shooter had chosen to destroy so many lives. Investigators repeated the same difficult truth. Every lead had been pursued, every detail analyzed, every avenue explored. They had not found the motive. Eventually, the FBI released its final report. It was thorough, analytical, but devastatingly inconclusive. It stated that Paddock was driven by a complex combination of psychological, behavioral, and financial factors, but it acknowledged that no single, definitive motive could be identified. It concluded that he likely sought a sense of power, control, or significance. An explanation that felt painfully insufficient for the magnitude of his actions. Many found it unsatisfying. Some found it infuriating. But it was, according to investigators, the most honest answer available. The lack of closure created its own form of torment. People are not built to accept senselessness. They seek cause and effect, logic, narrative, reason. But the Las Vegas massacre defied these instincts. It forced people to confront a reality in which a man could meticulously plan mass murder without leaving behind a trace of intention. It forced investigators to admit the limits of behavioral science. It forced families to live with wounds that could never fully heal. In the years that followed, survivors formed support groups, attending meetings where they could speak openly about their trauma. Some found comfort in shared experiences. Others struggled, haunted by memories. Therapists described the survivors' trauma as uniquely complex, not just because of the violence, but because of the lingering uncertainty. The unknown motive acted like an open wound, refusing to close, keeping the trauma fresh. The city eventually built a permanent memorial. It became a place where visitors could reflect, mourn, and honor the lives lost. Families traveled from across the country to leave flowers, letters, and photographs. The memorial became a public acknowledgement of the tragedy, a symbol of resilience, and a reminder of the fragility of life. Investigators who worked the case said privately that it was one of the most haunting of their careers, not because of the violence, but because of the void that surrounded it. They could track every bullet, every purchase, every movement, every detail of planning, but they could not enter the mind of the man who orchestrated it. The missing motive became a specter that followed them long after the case was closed. Many expressed frustration. Some questioned their own abilities. Others accepted that some mysteries remain unsolved, not for lack of effort, but because the truth was never recorded. To this day, the Las Vegas massacre stands as a chilling reminder of how a single individual, acting alone and without warning, can alter the lives of thousands. It revealed the vulnerability of crowded spaces, the rapidity with which violence can unfold, and the emotional devastation that lingers long after the physical wounds have healed. It tested the resilience of a community and the limits of investigative science. But perhaps the most unsettling legacy of the shooting is the silence that surrounds it. The silence Paddock maintained throughout his life. The silence of the destroyed hard drive. The silence of the final gunshot that ended his own life. The silence left in the hearts of those searching for answers that never came. Silence, in many ways, became the final weapon in his arsenal. A weapon more enduring than the rifles he left behind. The story of the Las Vegas massacre is not just the story of a crime. It is the story of uncertainty, trauma, resilience, loss, and the human need for understanding. It is the story of investigators who combed through the ashes of destruction, searching for the spark that ignited it. It is the story of families who learned to carry grief like a second skin. It is the story of survivors who refused to let terror define the rest of their lives. But above all, it is the story of the unanswered question that will forever linger like desert wind against the side of the Mandalay Bay. Why? And because that question remains unanswerable, the tragedy of that night continues to ripple, not as a closed chapter, but as an open wound etched into the collective memory of a nation. A wound that speaks not through explanation but through the lives forever changed by a man whose motives vanished with him, leaving behind only silence, sorrow, and a mystery that time has yet to unravel.